This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Good afternoon, this is Tech Talk and I'm Frida Liu and I'm here with Drew Williams, the CEO for Condition Zebra Inc. We're going to be discussing about policy compliance and hacker research. So Drew, Condition Zebra, what is this and how did it come to be?
Well, thanks Frida for having me today. Let me just give you a quick background. Condition Zebra is actually it's a rebranded consulting firm that some partners and I started back in the late 1990s after we participated in helping to create the whole security enterprise known as Symantec. We decided that along with some of the work we were doing with vendors that we would help in the area of consulting with respect to all these tools and infrastructures, especially surrounding the growing need for governance, risk, and compliance measures. And we found that there was a growing need more so overseas than there were in the United States and in Europe, primarily in Asia, because of the nature of doing business with the so-called West and all the new policies and procedures that were being put in place.
And so you've been in information security for a long time now?
Yeah, in one capacity or another, I've been involved since 1979 when I was in the U.S. Navy.
Right. So back to what we're discussing now. What are a few key areas of concerns should we understand about information security and its impact on our lives and businesses?
Yeah, it's a problem. Interestingly, it's a problem that was much more of a mystery. It was kept in the shadows for such a long time. But it's rooted now into the operational flow of technology, which means it gets real attention. It usually has its own billing cycle and cost center. And there are lots and lots of solutions. And frankly, if you look at security as a whole, there's no longer a unique footprint associated with one kind of problem or another. There are so many different ways in which security issues can affect business or technology that it's almost just like a pedestrian now. It's not a unique problem. It's part of the common flow of just doing business and engaging technology.
Do you see any differences in this area in the U.S. and in the UK compared to out here in Asia?
Oh, yes, absolutely. There are some significant differences. Interestingly, in my opinion, with respect to communications technology, for example, Asia is always ahead of everybody else. You guys are the first to really introduce the super tech, tools that we all end up getting over here. But a couple of areas, just the feasibility and implementation. There are issues with respect to country to country. Whereas in the U.S., we're all based on English, for example, and our language and our programming skills and everything are generally along basic lines. Where you're dealing with Europe, it's still the Romantic languages and so on. But cultures are pretty much the same. In Asia, you have language barriers, you have cultural barriers. One nation might follow a certain culture, which might cause restrictions to activity versus another one. You have technical infrastructure variances. You have policies, for example, that might not even make any sense in one Asian domain or environment, which might make perfect sense in Europe. Then you have staffing variances. Some areas throughout Asia, expertise or even exposure to the business model might vary depending upon what's going on in that area. So it is not a hack-specific problem. It's an aptitude-specific problem.
All right. When talking about compliance and risk, and why is this now becoming such a popular topic of discussion and investment by business owners? And do you see the same kind of conversations in the West and in the East?
Oh, that's interesting. What we've had, with respect to risk and compliance. Risk rises anytime you introduce a variation in how you do things. You always have a new risk. Back in the 90s, I used to explain it as every time you do something new, say with transportation. Let's just take an automobile, for example. Once you get in an automobile, you're already at risk of having something happen, right? If you increase speed in an automobile, then you might want to secure yourself from, say, great risk of going through the windshield should there be an impact, so you introduce yourself to a seatbelt. to reduce the risk of damage should you, actually hit the steering wheel, you introduce an airbag. And then you introduce ABS brakes, et cetera, et cetera. And what you're doing is you're not eliminating the risk of having a car accident. You're reducing the risk of damage to the most critical asset, which is the individual inside the vehicle. And so as more people and more organizations start doing business in standard ways, well, I'm going to use the internet, I'm going to have a web presence, I'm going to work on the cloud, et cetera, you start creating consistent patterns. And it's through those consistent patterns where compliance needs start to emerge. And first they're suggestions, and then they become kind of guidelines, and then somebody gets involved and makes them an edict, and then it's a requirement, and then it's a mandate, and then you're going to jail if you don't do it. And it's basically, it follows along sociological trends and cultural trends for how we operate and how we evolve, whether it be in the sense of communicating with one another or transacting with one another.
I like the car analogy, by the way. I'm here with...
Thanks.
I'm here with Drew Williams, the CEO of Conditions Zebra Inc., and in just a moment we'll continue our discussion on policy compliance and a little bit about hacking. Tech Talk, BFM 89.9. Good afternoon. This is Tech Talk. Frida Liu here with Drew Williams, the CEO of Conditions Zebra Inc., and early on we discussed about policy compliance and why is compliance and risk becoming such a popular topic of discussion and necessary topic of discussion, if I may say so. Now, regarding the issue of compliance, it sounds like people must maintain a set of standards or face consequences. And generally speaking, who even decides there has to be a standard in the first place?
Oh, that's a great question, Frida. Now, when you think about standards, again, I was talking about the automobile. Let's take it one step further. Standards were introduced, like usual, from creating a common process for doing things. For example, which side of the road to drive on? Well, when the automobile was invented, and you can claim whoever invented the automobile, whether it be the French or the Germans or whomever else, then they had to make the decision, well, now where do I drive this thing? Well, in Europe, for example, many of those those countries had created a policy from how they rode their horses, throughout the Middle Ages. And England, of course, wanting to be different, wanted to throw it on the left side of the road versus the right side of the road. And then every one of their colonies ended up adopting driving on the left side of the road. And for anybody who doesn't drive on the left side of the road, it's really confusing, so on and so forth. So it came out of just, again, the evolution of how people do things. And in fact, if you drive on the right side of the road in Malaysia, you're going to probably get in a wreck or get a ticket or go to jail, You drive on the left side of the road in the United States, and people are going to, first laugh and then call the police, and you'll end up with the same result. So you have to comply to a set of standards. Well, I need to drive my vehicle. I guess I have to do it on the right side of the road when I'm here and the left side when I'm there. And that's really how they evolve. Now, with respect to security standards and compliance, and governance, risk, and compliance, or GRC, those standards a lot of them came out of British regulations and U.S.-based regulations for how to conduct transactions with individual files. For example, in mid-1990s, two U.S. senators, Kesselbaum and, of course, Ted Kennedy, did not like the way patient records were being transacted among healthcare organizations and pharmaceutical companies because they felt they were being exploited for their privacy. And they enacted a policy that said, we want to protect these rights of these individuals when it comes to, trafficking their information, and that's where the whole HIPAA policy came out, which was loosely based on banking policies for client banking records. And obviously other people adopted those, and they became British standards like 17799 or 7799, and then the ISO, the International Standards Organization, adopted it from there, called it ISO 17799, saying that if you conducted any personal transactions that had to do with individual records, they had to meet certain secure requirements. And my team and I were involved in some of those creations back in the day, back in the 1990s, and we kind of saw that whole evolution go forward. And it's getting bigger because as more people conduct business, whether it's like payment card industry, PCI, DSS, where you have to transact money across the wire, these kinds of policies are starting to become more of mandated around the world. And other countries are starting to look and say, well, we've got to get on board with these too. I'll give you a real quick example of how one policy has completely changed the safety of the world. Back in the 1970s, it was made an absolute fact and a common law that every air traffic control center in the world must standardize on English. And so every air traffic control center, from the most remote islands to the most cosmopolitan cities, all must know English, and pilots must be able to understand English in order to fly their planes. That's a standard, and it become adopted so that it becomes now the actual standard of operation worldwide. And in transacting commerce, that's what we're seeing now. And of course, every time you introduce a new standard, you introduce people who don't want to play with it, and that offers new risk.
Interesting. Okay, moving on to hacker activity. What are the hacking trends right now, and how should people respond to such things?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So we got a couple of trends going on. Obviously, mobile hacking is up at its finest hour now. Everybody's got a handheld, and everybody's trying to break into it, creating their own mobile apps. Wire to wire, face to face. You can spoof just about anything now. Obviously, I remember when I was at a hacker conference in Las Vegas a few years back. It was Black Hat, I think, probably in 2001. And the question was, what are the top operating systems that are being targeted? Well, obviously, the Windows operating system is number one, and then a few Unix operating systems, and then some guy yelled from the back of the crowd, well, what about Apple? And everybody laughed. And everybody knows that Apple is a proprietary Unix-based operating system. Well, now it's one of the top, infrastructure operating systems that is targeted primarily because of the handhelds with the iPhones and iPads and iPods being so, loosely carried about and so easily communicating with others. So downloads mean something new. Another trend is the cloud. And a cloud is a fancy word for doing business virtually, storing your data somewhere else in a virtual location that can be accessed from anywhere in the world. And so cloud-based computing security, infrastructure security, of course, is always at risk. Most of the hacks are still relying on old common hacking practices like buffer overflows and denial of service attacks. And those are the trends. Generally they stay with things that work because people still are not securing their infrastructures, and they can do it so easily they can reduce the risk by just conducting some basic things, and they still overlook those.
Hackers, in these sort of cases, is it more to the individual or is it more to corporations? And, how does it affect the average person, family?
Oh, you're like an individual versus a family or
the organizing,
sure. Yeah. Well, generally speaking, they go for the big prize that's going to get them the big noise, and the big prize that gets the big noise is taking out a knock or a. So they're looking at the big targets. And then you've got target organizations like Anonymous. Anonymous is kind of a movement more than a group, and they're kind of a group that is kind of an anti-group, which is loosely connected around the world, that picks their targets to attack or support. For example, they attack child pornography worldwide, but they support the right to choose, and they attack people that try to restrict their movements or restrict the movements of other people, or they support good causes for reaching out to save various political entities or whatever. So the individual generally isn't at risk unless they do something to introduce a problem to their infrastructure. And that happens quite often. We call them stupid user tricks. I do them all the time. Everybody does.
What would you like to see changed in information security in the coming years that will possibly stop security threats?
Well, nothing's going to stop security threats. That's impossible. The best we can do is reduce risks, and that's what our business is in. Our company's in business for, and that's why we go to a lot of these events and activities. We need to rethink how these new forms of computing and communicating, are used, the internet, social networking, and so on. We're still very new at this. Sort of like kids with a really fast race car. Here I am at the Formula One race in Malaysia. I got this great, awesome car. I have a driver's license, but they really don't have any idea how to keep it on the track or what the objective of using that vehicle is about. You take new technologies or new capabilities like what's available in the cloud, how to use a handheld in new ways. Those are huge, huge open opportunities to create new business and new ways of communicating and transacting business, and it certainly makes the world a lot smaller place, but it also opens a Pandora of opportunities to create problems. Much of those problems are created by accident or inadvertently, and many of those problems are exploitable or exploited by experts who understand how to break things. So we are still very young in this space. There's a term that was introduced within the last 5 years, digital natives versus digital immigrants. And, you and I and people of our age and our generation, we're all digital immigrants. I remember living in the United States where I had a phone extension that was only 4 digits, and, in the U.S. now 10 is standard. And we had party lines. Well, my children, I have 5 daughters, and several of my children were born not knowing a time when there wasn't a cell phone and there wasn't an internet. They are the digital natives. They're the generation which will completely embrace technology as we have not seen it in the past. And, so, to your question, what would I like to see changed? There has to be more awareness of how things work, and I think it needs to be introduced at a much younger age and a much earlier stage in the learning process. And it will inspire new creativity, but at the same time, it will offer new strategies to solve bigger problems and create even greater opportunities for communications and even transportation can be affected. So those are the things that I find really intriguing about the next 40 or 50 years, maybe even the next 10 to 20 years.
Well, thanks for sharing your insights. I've been speaking to Drew Williams, the CEO of Conditioned Zebra Inc. This is Tech Talk, BFM 89.9.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.